Hello, good evening, and welcome to the latest edition of Resistance TV. In tonight's programme, we're going to be looking at the state of the left in Britain today. The demise of the Corbyn project and the election of Sir Keir Starmer as the leader of the Labour Party has left thousands of former activists feeling demoralised and bereft. Joining me to discuss the state of the left today are Dave Roberts, who helped to found the Socialist Labour Party with Arthur Scargill in 1996 and was the party's vice president for a number of years, and Phil Bevin, who works in the lead of the opposition's office under Jeremy Corbyn. And Phil's an author, an independent academic, researcher, and a community activist too. Phil, let me start with you. I mean, a lot of people are looking to the Peace and Justice Project that was established by Jeremy Corbyn in 2021 to offer some leadership to the left. I mean, from your inside knowledge, is that leadership likely to be forthcoming? I mean, after all, Jeremy posted a statement on Facebook yesterday saying that members should choose their candidates, devise policy, and decide what the movement stands for, which was pretty much what I was campaigning for in the Democracy Roadshow when I was still a member of the Labour Party.
Well, just to be clear, I don't have any connection to the Peace and Justice Project or inside knowledge of it. So I'm just I'm looking in from the outside and speculating a bit. I do know. I mean, I worked with some of the people who were close to it when I was in Lotto, so that's kind of my connection to it. And I don't know if, you know, for instance, I don't know who's employed by it and who's just kind of in its orbit and that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, I love Jeremy. I think he's a really, really good guy. But I'm a little bit concerned that he's getting caught in the middle of a split that has, I think, took place at least in 2016 on the left and has been widening ever since. And it's a split between what I would regard as proper socialists and the sort of soft left liberals that you find in Momentum and on Novara Media. And I think it first became apparent with the attacks on Jackie Walker and some of the allegations and accusations of anti-Semitism surrounding her. And that was when you had this division that Momentum leaders, anonymously in an article for the New Statesman, I assume they're, you know, at least very close to the leadership, made a distinction between up-and-coming sort of people who were getting involved in the Labour Party politics as a result of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. And there was a term, I can't remember exactly, but it's something like canary reading conspiracy theorists. And this was 2016. And so you've got this kind of division between the desirable and undesirable left. And that is playing out now. People like myself, I think I'd probably fall into the canary reading conspiracy theorist category. But it's interesting because Jeremy's role has always been, and this is why he was able to bring in such support to the Labour Party in 2015, is to straddle the divide between the Labour Party left and broader leftist movements outside of the party. So you've got Stop the War, for instance, which he co-founded and which has ties to former SWP members, so people who aren't necessarily Labour Party people. And I think the current difficulty that he faces is that he's got to make a decision. Instead of being this kind of unifying figure between the Labour left and broader leftist movements in the UK, he's now, because of his situation with regards to the Labour Party, I think he's being forced to make a decision one way or the other. And in fact, I don't think if he's not careful, that decision will be made for him by Keir Starmer, because I don't think he's going to get the whip back. I really don't. And so that
do you think, though, then, Phil, I mean, just in relation to the Peace and Justice Project, do you think that will provide the leadership that a lot of people are looking to, that organisation to provide? I mean, or not? I mean,
I would say at the moment, I don't think it is. And I think it's because he's in this kind of liminal sort of state, not wanting to alienate the Labour left, while not yet willing to commit himself and his project to more kind of consistently sort of non-Labour socialist organisations, which of course will get him into trouble with people affiliated to the Labour Party. And let's remember that a lot of the people whose kind of circle is around him are still within Momentum. And so they have a vested interest in trying to keep him on board and keep him within the kind of the remit of the Labour Party. And so there's a bit of a tug of war going on.
There's no way back for Jeremy in the Labour Party, though, is he? He's not going to be.
No.
Well, I mean, he is a member of the Labour Party, but there's no way I can't see Starmer is going to allow him to stand.
No way,
as a Labour candidate.
The other thing is that I believe, I don't know exactly what relationships they have with him at the moment because I'm out of the loop, but I believe that some of the people who advised him in Lotto are still around. And for instance, I know that the Peace and Justice Project is affiliated to Progressive International, which is, I think the communications for that are done by Jeremy's former spokesperson and director of strategic communications, James Schneider, while the so-called apologise or move on strategy on allegations of anti-Semitism was being pushed in the leader's office. And that organisation is connected to the Bernie Sanders project, because it's funded by the Sanders Institute, and the Sanders Institute gets money from, well, billionaires, basically. So you've got this kind of soft captured left that is that is across the Atlantic in the United States, and a lot of leftist organizations in this country are tied into. And they tend to follow that split I described between the respectable, relatively mainstream people who'll be invited onto mainstream media, and the canary reading conspiracy theorists like myself. So I think it's a big problem, because if Jeremy's tied into this network, when it comes to showing the leadership, and I think when it comes to the future of the left, what we desperately need is people who aren't trying to win favor with mainstream media organizations and not trying to repeat establishment talking points so that we're quote unquote respectable. We need people who are actually going to drive forward with a proper socialist agenda. And when it comes to talking about situations in the world today, in this country, abroad, they're going to tell the truth. And I think, for example, just kind of last thing to say on this, I think one of the things that I think Jeremy's dropped the ball on is a little bit, I mean, not completely, but the current situation in Ukraine and the Russian invasion. So what we're seeing is a shift to a new multipolar world. Now, Jeremy's background, his whole history is internationalism and solidarity with developing nations that are pushing against US imperialism. But I mean, he has been, recently he's been to Brazil to support Lula, albeit with the kind of US sort of facing Peace and Justice, Progressive International. But he hasn't really articulated what this change in world affairs means for Britain, its role in the world, and actually the role that the British left should be playing in that, in building our connections with other countries, other nations, other sort of, and socialists within those nations. And that includes governments of, in my view, countries like Venezuela,
of course,
Cuba. And actually, just one more thing that's popped into my head. The other thing that I'm concerned about with regards to the Peace and Justice Project, and why I'm a little bit disappointed in it, I've got to say, is because I think that what's happened is that a lot of the people who are advising in Lotto, they come from this kind of...
Lotto being the leader of the opposition.
Leader of the opposition's office.
Yeah. Yeah.
They come from this kind of strata of political intellectuals, a fair few of whom went to private education. What they're not is hard-nosed campaigners in communities on the ground. So when it comes to what they're quite well, I actually don't think they are that good when it comes to media because of the whole apologize and move on strategy. But their entire kind of the people that they are focused on are this kind of upper strata of media professionals, journalists, and that kind of thing. What my strategy is, or what I would like to see the left do, is actually build a base of support in the streets, knocking on doors, taking on people's issues, and doing it that way, while also talking to left-wing socialist politicians elsewhere in the world, where they're actually achieving victories, like in South America, you know, and even having some relationships with like the Chinese government, because they're growing as a power in the world, and just, you know, for our country, for Britain, we need to be talking to developing nations, and we're not. And I would love to see Jeremy showing leadership on that, but I think he's being held back by the caution of some of the people around him who are worried that that won't play well with the soft Bernie Sanders momentum left. If you see
Bernie Sanders has proved himself to be a quisling, as we know. But let me bring in Dave now. I mean, Dave, does the left need to move beyond Jeremy Corbyn then, given what Phil has just said?
I mean, thanks for that insight, Phil. That was, I think, very useful for those of us who've spent a lifetime on the outside of the Labour Party looking in. Yeah, I think it's worth revisiting what the Corbyn project was, and perhaps look again at some of the issues around why it's failed. Because I don't think it's just about various wings of the Labour Party fighting it out for some sort of, you know, parliamentary leadership. Or leadership, in fact, the trade union movement as well. I think it goes much deeper than that. And I think we ought to, in understanding why it failed, what its limitations were, which I think is necessary before we move on as a left. I think, you know, we need to learn those lessons, partly because outside of the world of politicos, whether in the Labour Party or on the left of the Labour Party, there's massive things happening. And in fact, the Corbyn project was a massive event. Now, the first thing that, as I understand it, the first thing that, you know, I became a member of the Labour Party and even, you know, led a constituency party for a while. And I got entry into the Labour Party by campaigning against the Labour Party and actually saying, I'm a lifelong socialist that stood against you for nearly 3 decades. But I think there might be something in what's happening here, because it's not simply a falling out in the family of the Labour Party. There is clearly the rapidity with which 300,000 people joined that party to make it the biggest party in Europe. And also, I should say, the rapidity in which probably the 300,000 have become dormant or left means something else was happening other than the usual wrangle that occurs at different points in history of the Labour Party between left and right, and a struggle for the supremacy of one wing or the other. But clearly, there was a movement on the go. And the first thing I think that frightened the establishment was that Corbyn was elected. The second thing that frightened the establishment was that despite their scurrilous undermining of him as an individual and his leadership, he was elected again. But the biggest thing that really put the frighteners on the establishment was that 300,000 people had joined behind him. On a manifesto, I should say, it wasn't a particular radical manifesto. It wasn't, you know, offering the promised land now. It was a manifesto that clearly the right-wing establishment felt was going to be too costly, and too actually had aspirations in it which capitalism couldn't deliver.
Do you think, Dave, that one of the things that particularly scared the horses was the commitment around anti-imperialism and peace, even more than the domestic social democratic agenda?
Well, I think you're right. I was going to say, to go on, that and the thing about Corbyn is that has always been his political ground that he's fought on, is his anti-imperialism, his peace and justice. To his credit, he supported many regimes, many political organizations around the world that have taken on, imperialism in a stand-up, knockdown fight for survival and for the development of their own country, free from imperialism. And that has been one of his strengths, and that's why I've been quite pleased to share platforms with him in the past. But I think, if I can just come back to the point I was making, but the real frightening thing was that 300,000 people that joined.
Yeah.
And just, it's a rule of any warfare. And I think what was accentuated by those moves was that Britain was moving to a more acute form of class war. And that was driven by the economy. That was driven by Brexit. And then eventually it was driven by COVID and accelerated by all those features. And that, basic rule of general warfare, you don't allow your weapons to fall in the hands of your enemy. You will scuttle it. You scuttle fleets that are in danger of being captured. You blow up your own tanks rather than allow them to fall into the hands of the enemy. And clearly the establishment was so frightened about the Corbyn phenomenon and its development that they pulled all the stops out in both the media, all their connections in the Labour Party, all the sort of people that Phil said have actually been, they're placed by the establishment, whether it's American imperialism placing them through connections or whether it's British imperialism placing them through connections that have been placed to scuttle the Labour Party's left. Here is a vehicle that clearly, as far as they were concerned, had been captured temporarily by the left wing, and they would scuttle it rather than allow it to be used for any form of social progress under Corbyn. Because the other thing that Corbyn, interestingly, was promising, if I'm right, he talked about the manifesto that it had on offer, and it wasn't that radical. I keep saying it. I tell people, there's nothing in that manifesto that I didn't have as a 17-year-old. I had free university education. I had I lived in a council house that was provided by the local authority. I had free school meals. I had, free school uniforms. Most of that manifesto had existed way back in the mid-70s. But of course, what was being offered by Corbyn and what was being said at the time, that this was we would have a transformative manifesto delivered by a transformative government. And it's that I think that mobilized masses of people. And clearly, going to meetings during the Corbyn years, looking at the media, the football crowds that were fall behind him, Glastonbury, nothing has occurred in this country for not since the miners' strike, actually, in terms of mass support for a working class movement. And to have thrown all of that away, and it was thrown away, really, it beggars belief, but actually suggests that the leadership that Jeremy could offer going forward, and I think, Phil, you've hinted that you don't think he's not going to be up to the job of providing leadership for the left. I think why would any of the 300,000 people who joined behind him, having witnessed what happened, accepting he had the entire establishment beyond him? But what you do there is you try and fight the entire establishment. You may fail, but what you don't do is join in the establishment's campaign to scuttle left-wing progress of the Labour Party. And I think, either through inaction at those critical points in history is as bad as, being part of a reactionary counterforce.
Well, look, talking about moving on, though, Dave, from Jeremy, what's your thoughts on the emergence of these new political parties like the Breakthrough Party and the Northern Independence Party? I mean, as you know, they're part of the umbrella group known as the People's Alliance of the Left. I think you attended some of the meetings before they kicked us out of it.
I mean,
it was set up, wasn't it, by Thelma Walker, who was the Labour MP for Colne Valley from 2017 to 2019, and actually she was John McDonnell's PPS, Parliamentary Private Secretary, wasn't she? I mean, what's your thoughts about groups like that, political parties coming through like that? I mean, do they offer a vehicle for the left?
I think when we talk about the British left, I think you need to pick apart the bones of it, really. There are many people who call themselves left. There are many people who call themselves socialists, and what they are, and Phil, I think, referred to it earlier on about the so-called liberal left. There are those really who are left social democrats. They simply want to ameliorate the worst vestiges, the worst destructive elements of capitalism living under the free market system. That's their entire thing. That means that when the Labour Party lurches right, as it has done, then there's a space for them, they're concerned about that, but there's a space for them to operate as left social democrats. They don't, want to move beyond. They don't see fundamentally the problem being the economic and social system that we all live in and under. They see it as a representation for the masses solely, and that they will play the parliamentary game. They will join campaigns. They will try and make them better. They will try and get more. Actually, it's the same role that much of the trade union movement does. It's just to get the best deal under the existing status quo. So I would say that many of those groups are of that ilk. They've come to the fore because there's a vacuum that's opened up because of the lurch to the right of the Labour Party, but they're not necessarily socialists. And it's interesting that very quickly in those movements, they start looking and saying, oh, I'm really sorry, we can't work with them because they're coming up with, and of course, who are them? Well, they tend to be the people who are more socialist, who will probably have some sort of analysis about, well, actually, it is the system. And of course,
I was called pal too, by the way, just to, sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to make that
yes.
point.
What was that, Phil? I missed that. What was the point?
He was one of them. He was one of them. And so I was saying, so of course, we can't because they have this policy or that, etc., or we don't agree with that. So we can no longer work with them. And the worst one, of course, was that, and we can no longer work with them because they appear to work with someone else that we don't like. I mean, they really are serious. They're not socialists, really. They are social democrats with a, cloaking themselves with this left veneer.
So I guess you're saying that we should caution people on the left about getting involved with groups like that. Then I mean, that's not the vehicle, at all. From what you're saying,
people can tried. All of us on this call tried, and that's the point. We tried sincerely. And the problem wasn't that we didn't want to work with them. They didn't want to work with us. There's not a lot you can do when organizations aren't serious enough to recognize that what you need is well, you do need to agree on first principles that you can cooperate. You do need to agree on that. And so that's why that didn't work. But you also, you need to be willing to work with people you can cooperate with and emphasize points of similarity rather than difference when there's bigger stuff at play. For example, anti-imperialism is something I care a lot about. And if you don't mind, Chris, I mean, if I talk for a bit more, I want to come back to that point about whether Jeremy can play a role in leading the left going forward. Because I think there's definitely a big role for him. I think actually, if you look at the situation he's in, and if I wasn't a bit disillusioned, I wouldn't be talking like this because I do have a lot of respect for him personally. So, I do feel a bit sad saying all this stuff. And I'm trying to be sort of coach it in in sort of soft terms, but Jeremy can bring a lot personally to another kind of socialist movement because he has a lot of popular support still. Legitimately. He's also got connections to international figures like Lula and AMLO in Mexico. They're big, they're important. And also, you know, there's the name as well. And I think if he stood as an independent in Islington North, he would win it. So you've got a parliamentary seat. So he's got the goods. I think also, personally, I think, Dave, you were perhaps being a bit harsh on him, given the fact that he was trying to lead a Labour Party into government, which I used to think was the way to do it. My experience has shown me otherwise. But that requires compromises and not getting kicked out of the leader's office. And that's not to say that I agree with a lot of the stuff that happened, but there is a reasonable explanation for why what happened and what the leadership did, why they did what they did. But we're not in that situation now. We're in a different situation where we have by necessity, the rest of us, socialists, proper socialists, are having to move forward, regardless, because we can't wait for individuals, however much we might like them or respect them, because we have to do this anyway, because things are really, really bad. They're terrible internationally. Our country, along with the rest of the West, could be very, very isolated very soon. This is playing out in real terms on the streets with, you know, energy bills, rising inflation, all this kind of stuff. So
I want to come on to that in a minute, actually, Phil, about stuff,
okay.
you know, group, you know, people getting involved on campaigns like that. But is what you've just said, though, Phil, a sort of a counsel of despair in relation to what Jeremy, you were saying in response to what Dave had said, that you felt Dave was being a bit unfair or a bit unkind because Jeremy had to make those compromises because he was leading a party to trying to get into government. Does that mean then, in your analysis, that if we were to get to a position, Socialist Labour Party, let's say, for example, where we were on the cusp of potentially getting into government, that we would then have to start making compromises in order to get into government? Is that your analysis, or are you saying that was then? Right.
No, my analysis is that it was his position as leader of the Labour Party. Right. My analysis is the problem wasn't necessarily Jeremy. The problem was the Labour Party and also the kind of social democratic infrastructure that surrounded it, like Momentum. And partially there's a flaw there in Jeremy's thinking, and actually in my thinking, and lots of your thinking as well, Chris, at the time, is that you could use the Labour Party as a vehicle for socialism. My point is we're now beyond that kind of phase. We all should be able to recognise now that you can't use the Labour Party as a vehicle for socialism. And actually a lot of the democratic infrastructure around that was not helpful. Momentum was not helpful. It was actively undermined sensible efforts to change some of the messaging that was coming out of Lotto. And one of the things that I think didn't have to be as bad as it was the media strategy sometimes when it came to countering all these smears.
Well, let me just come on to the media then, Phil, because I mean, another important aspect to think of, you know, the state of the left today is where we are in terms of the left media. I mean, we all know that the left doesn't get a fair hearing from the corporate media, but I know that you've expressed some concerns about some of the new left media. I wonder whether you could just sort of summarize what your reservations are, and maybe even, you know, single out the left, because it's not all the left media that you've got concerns about, but there are certain influential left media outlets, platforms that you have expressed some concerns about. And I think that's an important aspect in terms of where we are, you know, the state of the left, because clearly the media, you know, is just an important aspect of that. So just tell us what your reservations are about left media.
Yeah, I mean, that's relevant to the point I was coming on to. So this is quite a good opportunity to talk through it, actually. So with the current left media, it's, as I was saying earlier, about the ties to imperialist establishments in the US and in Europe. For example, I've spoken about it recently on your Palestine Declassified show, which actually, Chris, is very good. I've been binge watching it.
Oh, right, We're uploading our back catalogue.
Well, that's why I've been able to do it. I mean, this is one of the, genuinely, it's one of the best.
Because it's been banned by YouTube. That's been the problem.
Oh, right, okay.
So we can't get on YouTube anyway. The problem with
let's take Momentum, for example, right? It's where its funding comes from. So its funding comes from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. And actually the origins of that money are from the German Foreign Office and German Foreign and Development Office. And now normally when we look at something that's funded by the British state, we think, hang on a minute, what's going on there? And I think we should treat all state funding in the same way and assume that there is an agenda behind it. And obviously, Chris, you present a program on sort of Iranian-sponsored television, Press TV, and that will be putting forward your program because it serves their interests in some way. It's not always a bad thing. You just got to recognise that that's
every platform's got an agenda.
Exactly.
I mean, exactly. We've got to be realistic about that, of course.
But the trouble with Novara, and therefore you have to kind of look at what their coverage is, the kind of stuff they're saying, and whether or not it aligns with what you expect of them, your expectations and of their self-presentation. So this idea of this outrider radical left media that challenges the status quo, well, is Novara Media really that? It's not at all. You can largely tell that because it's people pop up on mainstream media all the time. It's an example of what has been described hybrid media. So it's new media based around the internet that relies upon legacy media like the BBC, like ITV News, in order to give its people platforms to grow their social media. So actually, some of this terrible communication strategy where you're accepting the establishment narrative may in fact be a genuine communication strategy on their part because they have to be invited back. And so you've got a whole clique of people still reasonably close to Jeremy who are coming at politics from this perspective, which is the perspective that we can't offend the establishment because our incomes are dependent on it. And so one of the things that concerns me about Novara Media in relation to the money they get from the German state via the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation is that, and it may be a coincidence, but they have been very poor on the anti-Semitism smear campaign. They've been very poor on NATO's role in the Ukraine war. And so some of the most important stories of the last few years, it just seems like every time you need them to be there, all guns blazing in your corner, they're not. And now this kind of does tie into Corbyn's role as well at the moment, because these people are in his circle. And I think this kind of point of view is partially responsible. It's one of the many reasons why the Corbyn project didn't work, but it is also preventing him as an individual from bringing his personal qualities into a more radical movement, which he has the capacity to do if he also has the will to do it. Because if he were to break with that kind of mentality, that sort of Labourist, soft left, appease the media, appease the establishment point of view, and come over to something more radical, he would be a great asset to us, whether he's leader or just, someone who shares a platform. But as it is, let's say if he were to be forced out of the Labour Party and then want to join a wider left alliance or socialist alliance, but bring the infrastructure that grew up around Lotto, in which a lot of it is still around him, into that mix, then he's actually not so much of an asset because, frankly, he's bringing a lot of not very useful people, not very useful perspectives with him. And who actually, if you look at the way, for example, and this was on Crispin Flintoff's show the other day, George Galloway handles the media in his combative.
That's a brilliant interview. I can highly recommend it. Anybody who hasn't seen it, this is very, very good, I thought. But anyway, go on. Sorry.
What he does is the opposite of the communication strategy
that
Jeremy was advised to take. Now, if he's going to bring in those sorts of people, and you know, I suspect some of them have fairly high regard for themselves and their craft, it would just be it'd just be a headache, to be honest with you. Whereas what you need,
I had experience of that, Phil. I mean, as a sort of an outrider for Jeremy, when I was an MP, and I'm not putting myself in the same category as George, because George is is a master of the media and so on. But that was that was the sort of tactic that he talked about challenging the bullshit, the narrative that was being put forward on a range of topics, but particularly on the anti-Semitism one. But not just on that, but on so many other issues, I was almost on a daily, particularly when I was on the front bench, almost on a daily basis being phoned by somebody in Lotto to say, why have you said that? Don't go on this program. You can't say this. We're going to put someone, they never wanted me on. And if I ever did manage to get on to a program, I was on quite a bit at that time on various corporate media outlets, I think they used to hold their heads in their hands, because I would, challenge the nonsense that was being put out, and it was incredibly frustrating. You're absolutely right. I think to bring that mindset into any kind of different new left movement would be disastrous. But let me just move on today, because we're running a bit short of time, and there's one or two other points I wanted to make. And I just want to move it on, Dave. I mean, I think you and I have spoken about this. A lot of people see politics, don't they, through the prism of political parties and elections and so on. And I just wanted to sort of, if you could give the experience, benefits of your experience. I mean, you were very active during the miners' strike, which saw raw state power, didn't it, being deployed to smash a working class uprising, which is what it was, I think. I wondered whether you saw any parallels with today and what's happening with industrial action rising, and if you do, can we win this time? And also just say a bit about why it's important, why a movement is important, why working class movement, not just focusing on elections, is crucial. And I just think your experience, and because you were steeped in the miners' strike, you did so much during the miners' strike, I think that's a really good case study to sort of tease out a little bit about and learn lessons from how we might take forward some of those lessons today.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Chris. The miners' strike, probably the most important event in the history of the British working class. And what was crucial about it was simply it wasn't a trade union struggle against the state. It became a mass movement in the UK, which was then internationalized around the world. I mean, workers were supporting it. There were strikes in the States. There were dockers on strike in Australia. Afghan workers were raising funds. Workers across the world were sending in resources because they knew that the struggle against particularly British imperialism and its particular right-wing government was their struggle as well. And they saw the miners as having gone beyond a simple trade dispute to something else. And it was clearly that, not of their making necessarily. I mean, the thing begins, of course, around simple economic demands, but it very quickly transformed into a movement of the working class in Britain and beyond. So things like the miner support committees met every single week, would have had hundreds and hundreds of people attending, and they were doing various things. They were raising resources to sustain the strike, to sustain the miners, but we were fighting a class war. We were fighting a physical class war. It may have been, a lot of it may have been the push and shove of picket lines, but it very quickly escalated halfway through to a real struggle, which was a life and death struggle, both in terms of the way whole communities had been abandoned by the British state, no benefits, were no longer policed by the British state, and that other forms of social organisation began to rise. Miners obviously at the front of that, but committees to organise schools, alternative schools, committees to organise food distribution, and even committees to organise policing of some communities started to take place. If you like, embryonic councils of actions, we call them in the 26th strike, Soviets, we call them in the Soviet, just embryonic, didn't go more than that. And of course, not trying to belittle the that strike particularly, but 5 miners died during the course of that strike. And the brutality meted out on the picket, not just on the picket line, but in people's houses by the police, in communities, in pit villages, was unheard of in that generation's time. So that sounds like a council of despair, does it not? The other side of it, of course, was that the working class moved forward, looked beyond the limitations of the Labour Party, partly because it was abandoned by certainly the leadership of the Labour Party, not a lot of its membership, I should say, but the leadership of the Labour Party quickly abandoned it, and much of the right-wing trade union movement left it isolated. But a year of determined struggle has brought a movement forward, and there is a relationship, obviously, between movement and political parties and movement. The two need to go hand in hand. The way I see it is there's a movement. There always is a movement. It's either, nullified by the Labour reformism or trade union reformism, or it's facing real economic and social injustices and crises, and it comes to the fore, and it usually has to sort the issues out itself, because the establishment at that point, the establishment fears most is a independent working class movement that is a movement of itself for itself. And that's what happened in the miners' strike, and that's why eventually they had to close it down by any means necessary. So I think, the current situation now, I've not seen, I've obviously been around the block a few times politically in the past. I've not seen the ingredients of a real full-blown economic social crisis of the free market system being sort of played out in our eyes, in front of our eyes at the moment. The reduction of wages over the last 10 years, a decade of austerity, the rising prices, inflation, the whole generation of people who are being forced to pay younger generation being forced to pay for their education, older generation being forced to pay for their care, the collapse of the welfare state, in effect, and its outsourcing to profiteers. You've got a major economic crisis. You've got a global economic crisis in terms of the rise of China and Russia and India to start, taking on the leadership, or taking first place against American imperialism, the American economy. You've got all of that being played out. You've got I think the fracturing of globalized capitalism, Western globalized capitalism, as rival capitalisms start breaking down into their national blocks. And I think that's in some sense the history of Brexit. So you've got all of that playing out. It actually makes the miners' strike, we're going to close 5 pits, and we might use it as an excuse to deal with one particular leadership of one particular union. It makes that seem like a sideshow. But how quickly the Tory attempt to deal with one particular leadership in one particular union escalated to give us a struggle of titanic proportions. And I really feel that we're on the cusp now of a new movement, heralded by the 300,000 people who got in behind Jeremy and his project, heralded by that. But that's just the beginning. Now we've been put off track, and the establishment has as well, in the sense that during COVID, it actually funded the status of quo to just dampen any reaction to what was clearly happening. Couple that with the political crisis. I'm talking about the political crisis of leadership of all classes. The thing about classic crises of the free market system that have happened before, it is a crisis of all classes. It's a crisis for the establishment. They can no longer, they're exposed. They can no longer rule in the old way. And what have we seen? We've got them proroguing parliament. We've got them bringing in fascist police state powers. Haven't got round to using them on a regular basis yet, but they're there lined up to go. We've got a whole range of economic sanctions against the working class coming down the line. We have equally, on the other side of the coin, we've got a crisis of leadership for the working class, have we not? So we've got.
So just
bring those two together, Chris, and you are on the cusp of a movement, because for every reaction, there will be a reaction. I can see in the coming period, and it will come through all the things we know: inflation, electricity bills, lack of employment opportunities, educational opportunities, the collapse of their National Health Service because it's no longer funded or it's being outsourced. And at the same time, we are still expected as a class to be looking up to these parliamentarians, and yet they are ripping us off, at every single opportunity. Was it 300 million in Lady Mona's bloody bank account, whilst 50,000 workers are dying of a disease that could have been, dealt with so much better. All of that. Now, I don't think I'm unique. I think people have been watching all of that at play, but they don't have any political leadership at the moment.
It's the leadership which is key. But just briefly though, Dave, final part of that question was, I mean, the miners lost, sadly, ultimately. I mean, they were defeated, and all the pits were closed and the communities, were decimated. I mean, there were. But do you think this time it's different? Do you think we can win this time? That's the key. I mean, do you have an optimistic note? I mean, can we win this time? Notwithstanding, there's not the leadership there at the minute. But I mean, if we can get that right, I mean, can we win?
Well, I need to challenge you. You see, yes. What was defeated in the miners' strike was the 19th century institution called the National Union of Mine Workers.
Yes.
Right. That was what was defeated because it was found wanting, given the all-out class assault by the establishment. Yeah. What wasn't defeated was the miners' strike and the miners' struggle itself. In fact, what happened is that the miners went on having, to fight 10 years to keep their union funds from the hands of the establishment and to keep their leadership out of jail. But they then went on and founded the Socialist Labour Party, committed to getting rid of capitalism.
So I think that what you're saying is, I mean, so that experience, they could be the bedrock then. I mean, that's where the leadership maybe could come from, perhaps, or
there are enough of them around, aren't there, that went through that experience, that led that experience, and drew the lessons. The fact that they moved to a political party to establish a separate party, and again, this wasn't left-wing intellectuals necessarily, inverted commas. This was born out of a credible, struggle of the working class. The best leadership that the working class has thrown up in its history, I think, during that year, without doubt, in this country, I should say. There are plenty of other excellent leaders.
Yes, no, I mean, thanks for correcting me. I guess I was referring to in the very narrow terms about trying to keep those pits open and keep the coal industry working. But yes, it was certainly.
Can I just finish on a couple of things? And it's I don't think it's any accident that the leadership of the miners, of the miners' strike, Scargill, opens up the RMT annual general meeting.
Yes, this year, wasn't it? This year, wasn't it? Yeah.
Why? Because you've got a group of workers a generation later who are beginning to face some of the tribulations that the miners went through. So why wouldn't you turn to someone who went through the board strike? And they did. And the other thing I'd like to remind people of is that just people generally are getting it, I think. People generally are getting it. There was banners outside the last Labour Party conference, was there not, that said, at Brighton, and it said, what we need is a Socialist Labour Party. Now, that wasn't the Socialist Labour Party banner. That was, I don't know who, saying, this is what we need. We now need a Socialist Labour Party. Meaning, I don't think they mean, let's make the Labour Party socialist necessary. I think we need a party of the Labour movement that is socialist. And the other thing that I think is, and people I think are beginning to move. The environmentalists, they're all, the slogan, system change, not climate change. Some of the most astute environmentalists have, grasped the thing that we need to change the economic system in order to secure the future of the planet.
Well, Dave, that leads me on actually to the penultimate question, really, and we only got about 5 minutes left, so it'll have to be fairly brief response, Phil. It's just in relation to that point that Dave was just alluding to there about single issue pressure groups, I suppose. I mean, I think a lot of left wing activists, haven't they, have given up on party politics, actually, and I've got involved with single issue pressure groups. So some of them, are very laudable and do some brilliant work. And groups like Palestine Action, for example. I mean, they've chased Elbit out of chased them out of their headquarters and chased them out of one of their factories out of Oldham, I think it is. They're doing some brilliant activism, which is actually, showing dividends, as it were. But a lot of people are getting involved in, a range of different pressure groups. I mean, the groups like, Don't Pay, which I know you've got some criticism about, which was set up or founded, I suppose, as a response to the escalating energy bills, and other kind of environmental groups like, Just Stop Oil, that's concerned about climate change. Do you think, it's a productive way for people, sort of disillusioned activists to get involved in single issue pressure groups, and maybe they need to sort of choose wisely? But we've only got a few minutes left, Phil. Okay. So if you could
I'll try and be quick,
on that.
But it's quite a big question. So in terms of the pressure groups, we're talking about rebuilding a socialist movement in the UK, and so if we're going to build links with them, they need to be equal to the task and not counterproductive to the task. And again, this is one of the issues, going back to Corbyn, is that he's recently, this summer, sort of thrown his weight behind Just Stop Oil. Now, Just Stop Oil gets its money from the Climate Emergency Fund, which was established by incredibly wealthy people, one of whom was on the Council for Foreign Relations, the big US think tank, and has set up a business with 2 former CIA agents, which has something to do with using CIA techniques to protect brand security. That's where Just Stop Oil's money is coming from. So I have to say, I don't think they are going to be helpful in the class struggle. In fact, I think they're a diversion from it. And XR gets its money from similar places. So my view is, there's no agreement with those guys, because their funding model is on the Climate Emergency Fund website. It's explicit. It is inspired by venture capitalism. Like, they say that on their website. So it's a case of being like, by contrast, Palestine Action, definitely. It is something that socialists should work with. And it's a case of, and I think, Dave, your point on the miners' strike is that it was defeated because it was probably too narrow. It was a single target with the entirety of the state could then go against. So my point of view is we shouldn't run before we can walk. I think it's about bringing people together to talk, first and foremost, while we're each doing our individual activisms and things, to see if there is a room, at least for a non-aggression pact to begin with, and some sort of collaboration and working together on some issues, sharing platforms. And then just to lay the groundwork for something bigger. But I think a lot of my sort of friends in the Workers' Party, for instance, have been saying there's a lot of education that needs to be done, because in the sort of the left that came in to, inspired by Jeremy Corbyn, they don't really understand class politics. Ordinary people on the street don't understand that they're workers. So actually we're going right back to basics, the early days of political education and class struggle. So we need to just really be aware of where we are and what our expectations should be at this point in time.
Let me just finish then with a question to both of you, if I can. And we've only got probably about 3 minutes left to take us up to the hour. But let me talk to you, Dave. I mean, you've rejoined the Socialist Labour Party. I mean, do you think that has the potential to win any seats at the next election, or not?
I think everything is up for grabs at the moment. I think everything's in the air. I think the old established parties, the Parliamentary Labour Party has gone as a force. The right wing lurch of Starmer's rump of the Labour Party is means that anything is possible. But I really think this movement is going to be the key to it. Now, can I just say about individual campaigns
briefly?
Just individual campaigns. Subjectively, people will start a campaign to react against some injustice that they feel. Objectively, most of them are actually attacking the establishment. They don't necessarily consciously do it. They are. When they actually take direct action, they are attacking the establishment and the status quo. So I think that's one thing. And can I just finish on just quickly on something that Mick Lynch said, which is interesting because I think he starts where the miners' strike finished.
Being the leader of the RMT, the rail.
Leader of the RMT. He was speaking to a great show of solidarity with education staff and workers and lecturers, and he was complaining that people were complaining about him not being affiliated to the Labour Party, or his union not being affiliated to the Labour Party, and his response was, "I'm getting fed up of people saying I should be affiliated to. Why should we be shackled by the Labour Party?" And then went on to attack them. The dial, I think the dial is ready just to be turned up slightly with all the things like system change rather than climate change, with the breakup of the Labour Party, etc. Of why we should be, it should be reading, why should we be shackled by the free market capitalist system?
Yeah.
And that's got to be the core message of any new socialist movement, not a rehash of the left, not for a rehome, as you say, Phil, of the left of the Labour Party to get reassembled to do what they've done again.
Yes, indeed, and then get into those kind of compromises that Phil was talking about. I mean, that's it. But listen, last word to you then, Phil. It's going to have to be about a minute. I mean, you're a member of the Workers' Party. I mean, what's the electoral prospects for the Workers' Party, do you think?
Well, George is personally very popular in certain parts of the country, so he could win. It depends on the place and the candidate. But I also think that electoral politics are an important part of the mix, but they're not the whole thing. What we should be first and foremost trying to do is two things really. We need to do three things, okay? Build some sort of a putative socialist alliance, or at least non-aggressive aggression pact. So we have the widest collaboration of small organizations possible in an informal way. Two, we need to break the Labour trade union link. That's got to go because it's not serving anybody. And three, we need to mobilize people, and this is the most important one, because it needs to be not about kind of individual lefty celebrities going on MSN mainstream media. It needs to be about mobilizing ordinary people in their communities to take power for themselves. That's proper socialism. That's what we need.
Absolutely, and a great way to end the program. I think it's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you very much, Phil, Bevin, and Dave Roberts, for your insights today. I hope the viewers have enjoyed the discussion. It's probably a discussion we should return to, actually. We could have spent 3 or 4 hours talking about it, but I guess people's attention span probably wouldn't necessarily expand. I mean, I was rapt, but I just think we aim to be mindful of keeping it to a sort of a consumable length of time. But I think it is an important topic to return to. And thanks again, both of you, for your insights. Really, really interesting. And thank you, our viewers, for watching this evening. That's it for tonight. We'll be back next week, 7 o'clock on Resistance TV. So thanks a lot again for watching us, and good night.
Cheers, guys.